Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jed Lee, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you join us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcast. Join us right now from not too far away from our beautiful studios here in Reedville. Our guest is here today to celebrate her middle grade novel. It's called The Song of Us. Please welcome to the show, Kate Fussner. Hey, Kate, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm delighted. Always happy to speak to a neighbor, and really happy to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this. As an author and as a former English teacher, reading with kids is always at the forefront of my mind. So I'm so excited to be here.
Well, you know, before we jump into finding out about The Song of Us, since you brought it up, you were sharing with me, you taught in a middle school and also high school level. A lot of people are like, yes, I have to read with my 4-year-old. I have to read with my 5-year-old. I have to help them learn how to read. But once they're reading on their own, that's it. I'm done. I don't have to talk about another book with my kids. Can you talk a little bit about the value that comes from us continuing to read with or co-read with our older kids, you know, reading a book at the same time and having those conversations with kids?
Well, I think it's so important on so many levels. First of all, I think as kids get older, they naturally want to test boundaries and see what they can do independently. And so often young people might resist the idea of reading alongside or the same book as their adults. And that makes sense to me. I understand that desire for independence. And so sometimes it may not make sense for a young person to read exactly the same book as their parent. But it is so important that adults share their authentic reading lives with young people so that they understand that as you go out into the world and people stop making you write a 5-paragraph essay about a book, it's still important to read. And there's all kinds of things out there to read. And it's so important that young people and adults find those things that they love to read and discuss them with each other. Books are great starting points for important conversations, whether it be about things happening in their personal lives or in the world. And I think that books can serve as sort of a neutral zone. Sometimes when teens are having a difficult time, it may be even harder for them to talk specifics about their own lives because it's a level of vulnerability that can be hard to share. Having a book as a conversation point between a young person and a parent or a young person and another adult in their lives serves as a place where, well, I'm not exactly asking this for me. I'm asking about this character and what they're going through. But the young person may walk away with more advice than that person realizes because the book was like the fertile ground for the discussion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so very, very important. And I think, too, and of course, when you're talking about encouraging kids to read, we're not talking about just hectoring them and saying, read a book, read a book, read a book. It's read yourself and let your kids see you reading.
And discuss the things you don't like to read. Discuss the times where it is hard. I am a voracious reader. I always have been. But there will be weeks at a time where I will start a book, read 10 pages, not really be feeling it, put it down, pick up something new, try that on. Nope, this is not what I'm feeling. Maybe I have to go back to a book that I have read and reread in my lifetime just to get back into it. And all of these pieces are part of very normal reading lives. And I don't think that as adults, we discuss that enough with young people. It's either you love all books or you don't read. And there's so much in between. And I think we need to do more to kind of honor what real reading lives look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things, too, that I think is so valuable about reading is that it gives us time, especially when we're talking about getting news or information. It gives us time to slow down and to really evaluate. So hard when you're listening to something, you're seeing something on TV, but you know, there's a splash, there's a headline, this happened, that person said this means this. We don't have the time to really sit down and dissect everything. A lot of times you read a headline in a newspaper and it's like shocking, oh my goodness, and then you read the article and down around page, paragraph 15, it's like, well, that's not quite, that headline doesn't quite match what's down here in our paragraph 15, maybe. And I think that's important. It's important for all of us to really get the information that we need and to make up our own minds so that we're not being told how to think by somebody else.
Absolutely. And books and articles and really even like reading different fiction online, they serve as conversation points, but they also serve as a way for young people to start to understand the kinds of questions they should be asking when they read. Mm-hmm. They can learn about how stories and news are structured so that they can know, I actually can't get everything just from the headline. I need to go deeper because a journalist on the other side of this went deeper. And so it's my responsibility to learn more than just the 6 words that they boil down for me to click on.
Yeah.
So I think that in stories and in news, there's ample opportunity for young people to learn about how to explore the literate world.
Yeah. And one thing we don't realize is that typically the journalist that does all the research and writes the article has nothing to do with the headline. That's somebody else that's just looking to get people's eyeballs on the article.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, we're talking about asking important questions. It's like wicked, as we say here in Boston. It's wicked important for me to ask you what the Song of Us is all about.
Sure. So the Song of Us, which actually takes place in a fictional Boston middle school, is a queer middle grade novel in verse that is a modern retelling of the Greek myth Orpheus and Eurydice, but it is set in 7th grade. And it stars 2 girls named Olivia and Eden who are forced to figure out how to love themselves as they love and lose each other forever.
Interesting. The first question that I have to ask, and excuse me if this sounds like a dopey question, but I'm almost 100 years old. What's the difference, and is there a difference between a queer novel and a novel that has queer characters?
Good question. I think that I like to define it as a queer novel in verse because the queer romance is very much at the center of the story, and it is very much at the center of who that I write for, particularly in this book, but also because in the novel, it is not just a couple of queer characters and everyone else around them is heterosexual or cisgender. In fact, there are different characters throughout the novel who are living queer lives in different ways. And it was important for me, to readers, to see there is no one defined queer experience. Instead, there are different ways that queer young people and queer adults experience the world, and I wanted young people and young readers to see that in the story.
Well, and again, excuse it, the possibly dopey question, but when I was sort of in those high school and college years that we were talking about before we started recording, the word queer was considered to be a slur. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about the queer characters, who are we talking about, and why is that no longer a slur? It always baffles me. The words come in and out, and I never get the memos of what's okay and what's not okay these days.
I think it's a very personal decision when members of the LGBTQIA plus community choose to use the word queer. For me, I use it to describe this novel because there is representation of different parts of the LGBTQIA plus community in this novel, but there is no one identity being represented. This is actually not a lesbian romance story. One of these characters openly defines herself as queer. That is the label that she has taken on. One of these characters is closeted and questioning. She knows that it's not safe for her to be out at home, but also she is 13. She doesn't know yet who she is. She hasn't figured it out. And I wanted readers to see that that's okay. It's okay to not be sure and to decide that you need some time to figure it out. There is also a trans character who is Olivia's best friend, Lexi. Her trans identity is not a part of this story, but it is a part of Lexi's story. It is a part of her, who she is as a person. And then there are other characters. I don't want to reveal too many things because there is an adult character who comes up later who is also a lesbian, and the main character doesn't learn that until an important moment. But again, it's about, there are different pieces here that are under that umbrella. And for my comfort, I use that word, but I understand that not everybody has decided that that's a word that they're going to use.
Interesting. Was there one thing in particular that inspired this story?
I had been working on a novel in prose that was young adult. So it was for an older audience. It was way more words, and it was the only story that I thought I would ever tell. So I started a master's program because I needed some help figuring out how to write a novel. And when I finished the first draft of that young adult novel, my mentor said to me, "You did a great job. I know you're eager to revise, but you need to put it down for a few months and come up with something else. I don't want you to leave your graduate program with only one story. And I want you to consider what would it be like to write for another audience," because I was in a program for writing for young people, which spanned everything from picture books through young adult. I was furious at the suggestion that I should write for somebody else and that I should write a different story. I was like, I came into this program with this one idea for this one audience. This is what I care about. I'll never have a good idea again. So I stomped around the apartment for 45 minutes or so. And my wife loves to tell this story because I never get mad, and I was so mad. And so I'm stomping around. I decide it's time to clear my head. So I sit down on my yoga mat. I get ready to just take some deep breaths. And then all of a sudden it was like lightning. I wish I had a better reason. Oh yes, I was inspired by this moment in my life. No, it was like lightning. It had to be Orpheus and Eurydice. It had to be 7th grade. It had to be in poetry. And even though I had never written for a middle grade audience, and I had never written an adaptation, and I had also not written any poetry since I was in high school, I decided, yeah, this is absolutely the moment where I'm going to try to do all of these things at once. And that story became The Song of Us.
Wow. And what is it about this story that was best told through verse?
That's another great question. I think part of it is that when I think about Greek epics, they were often told through poetry. They were often told orally. And there's something about the spoken nature of verse that really moved me. The other thing is that I knew from the very start that I had this wild idea that the main character, Olivia, was going to be a poet and she was going to have a poetry club. And as soon as I started writing, prose felt wrong. It was my natural instinct to go to prose, and my gut said, nope, this is not going to work. Try it in poems. And what I discovered as I wrote Olivia and then as I wrote Eden was Eden's interest in music and her desire in figuring herself out and expressing herself through music also lent itself so well to poetry that the story flowed as soon as I gave in to this idea that, well, I don't really know what I'm doing, but this story seems to want to come out through poetry, and I will figure it out as I go. And that is what ended up happening.
Wow. And because I'm so not knowledgeable when it comes to poetry, I know that there are different forms. We just recently had Kathleen Bostrom was on talking about her picture book that was told in verse, and she said that in her the 16 different poems that she had in this beautiful book, there were 16 different types of poems. Is that something that we're going to experience in the Song of Us?
There are lots of different kinds of poems in this book. I primarily use free verse because that was how the characters and the way that they spoke and moved throughout the world made the most sense to me. However, I also experiment with concrete poetry, and that is when poems take on a shape of something that's being mentioned in the poem or an object from the setting, as well as some haiku. There is some experimentation with rhyme. And there's also some experimentation around removing capitalization and punctuation at pretty key moments in order to communicate a certain mood that Olivia lives in at her home.
Interesting. I just had a flashback to the James Joyce in a reading when I was a freshman in college, and I think I read the first chapter. I'm like, oh, I just read 35 pages, and there wasn't a punctuation mark in the whole thing. I have no idea what I just read.
Yeah, so hopefully readers won't find that they'll have no idea what they just read, although I do unfortunately also know that feeling. Olivia's home life is challenging because her mom suffers from severe clinical depression, and what it often means is that Olivia doesn't know if she is walking into chaos or into something that feels more stable. And so while Olivia's poetry that she writes when she's at school and even after school on the playground tends to have form to it, when she is home, what you'll end up seeing is that there's almost no punctuation. There's almost no capitalization because Olivia isn't able to control her home situation in the way that she attempts to control the other pieces of her life.
Yeah. That idea of kids, you know, we think of teenagers and, you know, a lot of us think, oh, these kids, they're beautiful. I love them, but they don't know what's going on in the world. And, their thinking is kind of chaotic. But to add to that, the fact that there's so many kids that are living chaotic lives and they're having chaotic home lives. How do you think we can best as a culture, as a society, help those kids? Because it's incredibly challenging for those kids to move on, to make their dreams come true when there's nothing concrete for them to kind of build a foundation on.
I think that there are so many places to start helping those young people. And the first is to give them space to express themselves, to express whatever's going on in their lives, and to believe them when they say that their home lives are difficult, or when there's something in their life that maybe they aren't sure yet how to talk about it or how to articulate how it's impacting them, but to give them the space to do so for when they're ready. As a teacher, my first responsibility was to help students become better readers and writers. But to me, it seemed impossible to help them really grow, especially as writers, if I didn't make space for them to be their authentic selves. And that meant making really intentional choices around the kinds of questions that I asked students, the kinds of space that I gave them, and the assignments that I gave them in order to allow themselves to trust that I was going to take them for their word, right? Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes as adults, we can be really quick to want to solve the things or fix the things. But until young people even have a way to articulate and feel that trust needed in themselves and in the adults around them to say what's going on, it's impossible for us to really support them and to give them the specific help that they need.
Well, I know as a parent, as a friend, that's the hardest thing for me, is to not want to automatically go and try to solve something. When someone comes to me and says, "Oh, this is an issue in my life," it's just immediate. It's like, okay, well, let's see how we can fix this. And sometimes that's the last thing that they want.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that I've learned in working with young people is to give them a choice. Would you like some support in ideas right now, or would you just like someone to listen? And oftentimes young people will look at me like, no one's ever asked me if I just kind of want to let it out, right? Everybody wants to just jump in and be like, well, here's how you fix it. Sometimes more than anything, what young people need is just a space to let it out. Because oftentimes they can figure out what it is they might need, and we need to trust that they'll get there without jumping in ready to try to superhero a situation that they could, in fact, figure out on their own.
Yeah. Kate, earlier on, we were talking about how we can support kids in reading, and one of the things you said is that it might not always be comfortable for a parent and kid to read the same book and talk about it, but if there was a family where the kids felt comfortable reading The Song of Us with their grown-ups, what kind of conversations do you think they could have?
There are so many conversations that this book touches on. For one thing, I do think that there are important conversations to be had about first love and first heartbreak. I think a lot of times young people, I can speak for myself. When I was a young person and I had those very first crushes, they felt so big. They felt like the whole world was hinging on this 6th grade crush. And if it didn't work out, I would never feel that way anyway again. And the bigness of it, I think that adults need to take seriously. And again, like, yes, we can remind young people that they will probably have those feelings again, and that's okay. But to talk with young people about, yeah, the bigness of these things, it's real. It feels real, and that's okay. We continue, even when we have big feelings, to move through them, and they can change over the course of our lives, and how you feel right now isn't how you're always going to feel, and that's okay. I think there's a lot in here about honoring the authentic emotions and experiences of young people. I also think there's a lot in this book about peer pressure. Eden, who is our Eurydice character in the story Orpheus and Eurydice, she does not die, unlike in the original Greek myth, but instead she experiences what I consider true hell, which is 7th grade. There is a lot of peer pressure. There is a lot of desire to belong, which is very, very natural at the 7th grade and also in adulthood. All of us are just wanting connections with other people. Eden has to learn some hard lessons about what it means to belong to herself first and to honor herself first. And I think that those are really rich conversations for adults and young people to have together, because I think that young people are often told by adults, oh, you'll figure yourself out. You'll know who you are. When you're an adult, you'll know exactly who you are, and you won't buy into any of this. And I'm here to say, I don't think that that's always true. Like, I think adults are often faking it. And I think that we need to be honest with young people that we are making it up as we go along just as much as they are. But if we can find ways to continue to honor our own values and our own beliefs, that's kind of where we're going to find ourselves the most grounded.
Yeah. I love that. I love that idea, and especially love the idea of helping our kids understand how important it is for them to learn how to belong to themselves before we worry about belonging to other groups.
It's such an important lesson. It's so hard.
Yeah.
It is a thing that in my mid-30s, I am still trying to understand. But I have so much compassion for young people who perpetually feel the pressure, like everybody else in this room knows what they're doing and I don't. That was always how I felt as a middle schooler. And to grow up and talk with adults now, and they're like, well, I also felt that way. If I look around the room and everybody felt that way, everybody felt like everybody else knows how to do this except me, well, then none of us must have honestly felt like we knew who we were. And then the conversation changes. Like, how do we make space for that for young people now and also in our adult selves?
Yeah. You told us earlier on you were horrified when your advisor said to you, put that original YA story down and write for a different audience and write a different story. Now that you get over your anger and you wrote The Song of Us in verse, is this an audience that you're going to look to continue to write for, and will you continue to write in verse?
Yes, I have a second middle grade novel coming out. It does not yet have a title, but it is coming out with HarperCollins in winter of 2025. So I'm continuing to experiment with verse, while also returning to young adult and looking at how to add some young adult prose to my shelf as well.
Awesome. Kate, where can we go to find out more about you and find out more about The Song of Us?
You can go to my website, which is www.katefussner.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at KA Fussner. And you can find me on Twitter, although not as much these days, at Kate Fussner.
We've had a really great and insightful time speaking to the author of The Song of Us, a middle grade novel in verse, from our guest, Kate Fussner. Kate, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast and will join us for the next exciting episode. If you want to make sure you don't miss a second of the show, please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Stitch Radio, wherever you get your podcasts. And also be sure to visit readingwithyourkids.com and download your copy of the Reading with Your Kids online magazine. It's free. It's available at readingwithyourkids.com. Just click on our blog. Before we go, I want to make sure that I give a big thank you to my team: Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Madison Dairies, Soji Franklin, Monica Rivera Sosa, Ann O'Leary. I want to give a big thank you to my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me, and most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.